Ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished guests, it is my pleasure to start the second panel of today's day of conference, which will be devoted to echoes of the feudality and longue durée of social structures. In this session, our distinguished panelists, here on site and online, will explore how historical structures of power and land ownership continue to echo in modern times, shaping local communities and perceptions of heritage. I would like to say that we have one change in program. We will have 3 speakers. Each of them will have 20 minutes to present the paper. After that, I will ask Professor Marta Kurkowska-Budzan for some comments, and afterwards we will open the floor for discussion. So please feel free to prepare questions to our panelists. And our first speaker is Cezary Lusiński from the Polish Academy of Sciences. Cezary Lusiński is a Polish historian and career diplomat. He has extensive experience in diplomacy and international business, specializing in conflict resolution and peacemaking. Currently, he serves as Minister Counselor for EU Enlargement Policy at the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Lusiński is the author and co-author of more than 10 books in history, security, and European integration. And today, Minister Lusiński will present on how the owners of palaces are perceived by local communities in the western part of Poland. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be back to my alma mater, as many other participants who just came back here after decades. Secondly, I'm glad to speak on behalf of the Polish Academy of Science, where I obtained my doctorate more than 3 decades ago, because it's a rare opportunity. Because being a career diplomat, I usually have to focus on a state perspective. Since I'm always also involved in a social non-governmental activities because of my family background, it's also more often opportunity to have interaction also on the issues that we touch upon today. Let me say a few remarks at the beginning on the way I prepared this contribution for today. I've gathered material mostly from a small region of Lubusz, which is a bit artificial region in the western part of Poland, but it constitutes part of the territories that we used to call regained territories, and they are simply the territories that Poland gained from Germany after the Second World War. After World War II, Poland was moved eastward, and that was experience of millions of Poles, including my family. We moved westward from the eastern Polish territories, which became Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, parts of these republics. I mostly gathered material from the region around Grünberg, Zielona Góra, but it proved to be similar to what my colleagues gained in 3 other regions that Poland gained from Germany after World War II. Particularly Ślezin, Śląsk, Pommern, Pomorze Zachodnie, and Ostpreußen, East Prussia, Prusy Wschodnie. The experience there is quite different from what other people have in the regions that used to be core Polish regions in central Poland. Why? Simply because in these particular regions where I live now, in Western Poland, there is virtually no tradition of Polish gentry. It's a tradition of German gentry. So the attitude used to be for decades after World War II, used to be double hatred on behalf of majority of inhabitants. Poles moved westward, sorry, because there were the owners of the palaces were both gentry and secondly German gentry. So there was double reason to expel people. I mean, our predecessors in the palaces and manors in Western, what is now Western Poland, and it also has a lot of influence in the current patterns of behavior or current patterns of perception of those who own the palaces and manors. Who are those people who bought from this state or communities ruined palaces and manors? They're Poles, they're Germans, they're French, Italian, Americans, Chinese recently. Anybody who had enough money to buy and at least try to bring it to this shape that it would be usable, at least. Most of the examples come from my own property, the Broniszów Castle, because I'm entitled to do so. I cannot show you the pictures from people where I was a guest, because they wouldn't wish that. But I had a robbery, my home robbed just a few days ago, so I don't understand the reason. And the previous robbery was like 4 years ago, so it happens, unfortunately. But as I said, these observations are also valid for all of the other regions which Poland gained from Germany after World War II. Because everywhere German gentry used to suffer the negative perception as both a privileged social class and members of a nation that Poles fought in the Second World War. And since this assumption still persists, there is a task for people like myself to contribute to change this perception. This region I'm talking about, Lubusz region, is, as I said, a bit artificial one, but historically is the southern part. This southern part of Lubusz voivodeship around Grünberg or Zielona Góra is northern part of Dolny Śląsk or Niederschlesien, Śląsk Dragański, Principality of Zagan, which existed until 1930s. In this particular region, Poles used to live along Germans. There was Czech rule in the region for centuries, in the late medieval centuries. But it was first after Austrian and then Prussian, then German rule. All in all, the region until 1945, for centuries used to be relatively wealthy region of a relatively wealthy and relatively well-organized state, either Austrian or German. I wish it was a case after World War II, but unfortunately, Poland, due to communist rule, was not in a position to administer this region in a proper way. What you see here on the picture is just renovated in the most important parts castle. It looked very different in 2010 when I bought it. Now many visitors come, and you know, it's thousands already since 2011 or 12, and still many of them are white excursions. I mean, Germans who come because they are interested in the region. But they come. Also, people from the countries come. I have neighbors from France, Italy, and also from Germany. I'll give you some examples where I'm entitled to by people to mention them, because they are still not feel comfortable. Obviously, things changed since Poland regained independence and changed its political system starting from 1989. And reconciliation between Poland and Germany contributed a lot to mutual perception of Poles and Germans. But we have to remember that from this particular region and the other regions I mentioned, the almost entire German population was expelled after World War II, or at the end of World War II, starting from I mean, not forced, but the only reasonable way was to flee before Soviet troops entered. And that was the experience of Germans in January and July. January and February of 1945. Yeah. This long-lasting perception that the region is temporarily Polish was preserved for decades. I spoke to many people from various social spheres, proprietors of a flat or a big house, and I asked why they don't repair. So when Germans would come back, and we'll go back eastward. I mean, really, this kind of perception prevailed in people, in respect of people born before the last war. So that's why nothing was repaired. And if it was a state-owned property, means a castle like this one, I mean, that belonged to nobody. That belonged to everybody, to the state, and to nobody. It was a place where one could grab material, if allowed, and especially after communism ended. And then there was a situation that nobody cared. There was already independent Poland, but we had so many problems that the condition of palaces and manors in Western Poland, well, it was given out by the state to local communities, and local communities were trying to sell it as quickly as possible. especially if the buyer would be Polish, or a foreigner, at least, on the unwritten condition that he would not be German. But some bought the property anyway. I spoke once to Baroness von Schichting, who bought a castle in the county of Schowa in the Lubusz region, the link with Śląsk, Dolny Śląsk region. And she used to be there her family used to be there for centuries, and with links to many Polish families from Wielkopolska or Greater Poland, which it was also adjacent. Obviously, she would have preferred to buy where in Schlichtengowa, because the very name was Schlichtengowa, was from their names, von Schlichting. And since this was not available, she bought in the neighborhood. And in patient toil, she rebuilt, which was then awarded by the improved perception by local Polish neighbors. Because at the beginning, it was the perception of her was negative. German, Gentry, who would have family links there in Schlichtengowa for at least 3.5 centuries. But then, when she showed this patient toil and also respect to new realities, she gained respect around the villages and town of Schlichtengowa and county town of Schowa to a large extent. The majority of people who bought the property were entrepreneurs. Most of them wanted to buy and sell then to Germans, or whoever would like to buy. In case of the Broniszów Castle, the property was sold to a family of lawyers from Poznań. I would not mention the name because the context is not positive one. And this family gained a credit, mortgage for that, used it for another purposes, and then tried to resell for good money to a wealthy German who would buy. And they were waiting for the wealthy German to buy for several years at the beginning of this century. And they finally found not a German, but Pole living in Switzerland. This man on the picture. It's myself standing like 7-8 meters from the ground with a chief specialist in reconstruction of sgraffito. That's a Renaissance way of decoration, which reappeared from later Baroque plasters, and this remnants of sgraffito plasters was only used as a background by Baroque artisans in the late 17th century. Though it was a fashionable style of decoration at the beginning of 17th century, but attitude to what is beautiful changes throughout century. When I bought the castle, I tried to save and redevelop whatever was the most important from cultural point of view, overall European cultural heritage. And I found in many instances Renaissance more attractive, more rare than the Baroque. And so you have to choose, because it's not possible to have half of a dress Baroque, half of a dress Renaissance. Though to a large extent, I keep it both until recently. What the others do? The others mostly redevelop such properties into hotels. They wouldn't like to spend 2 or 3 millions just on graffiti, on internal paintings and so on. They would rather focus entirely on reinforcing the walls, on rebuilding the floors, on replacing the windows and so on, and practical things. Obviously, Polish state, after many years of neglecting such properties, now it cares. I mean, in a way that is not ideal, I must admit, but this cares, and there is a supervision of whatever we do within palaces until now, and this is an obligation for whoever is an owner, whether either Polish or German or the American or French or Italian. There is life in many of classes. Say my neighbor, Mr. Piantini in Leeds, Disco, he admits people once a year in the spring. And sometimes he organizes a concert, open air, so people could come there. And he's got rebuilt only small part of large Leeds castle that used to belong to von Beuthen family. I'm in a better position because mine is smaller, and it's like 2,000 square meters, and I brought life back to half of that. Means 1,000 square meters, or 1,000 or 1,200 square meters. And here's the picture from library. People gather and see, look, obviously, a lot done more to do, but there is already life there. That's how Brunzel-Waldau looked like in Baroque costume, like 100 years ago. It was not an ideal condition, because the last German family from Karitz und Chammer, they had many properties, and this particular one is not easy to maintain because of the proximity of pond. There is a lot of humidity to fight with. And here we come to the last family that were the owners of this particular castle, and many others in Niederschlesien, particularly from Chammer and Kainz family. A long tradition of Schlesien German gentry from 14th century. When I managed to reconstruct castle to a certain stage, I just got in touch with Karl von Kainz und Chammer, and we started correspondence in English. Then he found it much more convenient to correspond in French, and so we did. We shared our experience with both, with respect and sympathy on both sides. But I understand it was easier for me because, being a career diplomat, I'm by definition more open to other cultures, other people, other nations. And also, he didn't care about, any way of regaining the castle, because the family has a good life in Annecy, France. So I invited them to come, and they accepted. Unfortunately, Karl von Kainz und Chammer died before the family reunion happened in 2018, but 25 of his family members arrived. They were my guests for 2 entire days, and they came from France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy, and they spoke those 4 languages, 3 generations of them. And the attitudes of people around, the expectations, towards the owners of palaces usually correspond with weddings, organizing concerts, and other cultural activities. Well, most of the people have entrepreneurial approach and organize weddings. I organize piano recitals, which is much appreciated by many, and also because it's free of charge. Here is an example of a property owned by a local institution which was neglected for many, many years. But with help of European funds, it became recently a community center for European activities. And that's in Ochla, now within the borders of Greenberg or Zielona Góra. Look, and it's marvelous condition. I attended the opening earlier this year, and this is a good way to follow. Here's another good example of using the space with furniture from Belgium. It's restored. It's got this climate and bring more life to this because the expectations of people who live in the nearby cities, intelligentsia of scholars, teachers, clergymen, they've got a certain sympathy to the places like this, and they would like to come to see the sites, to do some sightseeing, just like the group which is around the castle at this particular picture. I once organized a wedding, and then I had the problems with fiscal authorities for 4 years. So I won't repeat the exercise. Simply because as long as I'm a civil servant, I'm not allowed to run any economic activities. I can organize concerts free of charge, and that's what I do now. And here there are examples where how should you care for property. I mean, it's a patient toil because it was built centuries ago, not always from good material, and neglected for decades with running water. And this particular room, which is next door, it was really in a really bad shape, even in 2012. Then it was repaired and then neglected ago. Again, look at those people. They are interested. They come in large numbers to see how it is. But there are also good people, bad people. This particular picture is a picture of myself in my bedroom not so long ago in 2019. Just imagine what had to happen there. So that I needed to get out bricks out of my bed. And just a few days before it happened, I had American guests in this particular room because there was the main bedroom. So I just said it is to my guests. As I said, I organized one wedding, so the hall could be used in this particular way. It's next door to the ball hall. Ball hall is here, but in the ball hall, 500,000 zlotys was invested, but a lot done more to do. Here there was to be hall divided into 2 separate rooms for 300 years. Because it was not used as a dining room, it was most likely chancellery to run the royal property. With this, I would like to stop here because my time is over. But I would be glad to respond to any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. And now I would like to welcome our second speaker, Justyna Szklarczyk. Justyna Szklarczyk is a PhD student at the Doctoral School of Humanities of University of Warsaw and a member of the 19th Century Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Research teams. She is preparing her doctoral thesis on Masurian state farms and their adaptation of Eastern Prussian palaces. And today, Justyna Szklarczyk will discuss palace possibilities and potentiality of dwelling, the history of state farms in socialist Poland.
Thank you. Okay, so I will start. In my presentation, I will focus on the practices of repair undertaken by the new government in socialist Poland towards the working class and the working class itself. I am interested in the actions and memory of them that were intended to redress class injustice that was a consequence of the serfdom legacy. I understand the legacy of serfdom or the serfdom complex as a long duration of feudal relations in Polish society based on the power, ownership and dominance on the landed gentry in the symbolic sphere. Focusing on the period of socialism in Poland, I will show how the serfdom complex was dismantled but also strengthened during this time. Using the tools of cultural history, landscape studies, oral history, and broader ethnography, I am interested in the palaces of East Prussia that were taken over by the state farms after World War II. Focusing on the former territory of East Prussia, we are obviously, especially in Masuria, not dealing with the Polish landed gentry and its heritage, but the manor complex, which is part of the social reality of the settlers, is. I am especially interested in the everyday but also spontaneous and insubordinate practices undertaken by the workers of state farms, which served to establish themselves in this doubly new space, gentry and East Prussian legacy. As part of my research, I am conducting biographical interviews with former workers of selected state farms in Masuria, as well as analyzing competition diaries and text of culture. So I am interested in both the history from below of the state farms and their cultural history. As for my positioning in relation to the place and phenomenon under study, this is also the history of my family. My grandmother, a declassified single noblewoman and an accountant at one of the Masurian state farm, lived in several East Prussian palaces. My father and my aunt grew up in the palace and its surroundings, played football in the palace park and went fishing there. Talking about the positioning of the researchers seems especially important to me here at the conference on nobility, aristocracy, and gentry. Okay. Now I will turn to a brief historical context. In 1945, as a result of agreements at the Yalta Conference, Poland was granted, among other things, the southern part of former East Prussia. The annexed lands, so-called recovered territories, constitute 30% of Poland's new territory, and everywhere there, the rural landscape was dominated by state agriculture. The state farms, Polish Państwowe Gospodarstwa Rolne, in brief PGR, organized along the lines of Soviet sovkhozes, were based on state land ownership. Employees of PGRs work on state-owned land in exchange for wages, housing, and access to public services, healthcare, education, culture. On a symbolic level, state farms testified to the ongoing class revolution in which palaces and manor houses, nationalized and annexed for schools, kindergartens, workers' housing, and cultural centers, would serve workers from peasant families. The same was true in Masuria and Warmia, the southern two geographical areas of the former East Prussia, which were also unfamiliar cultural landscapes to new inhabitants to settle into. In addition, for Masurians, Warmians, and Germans who choose to stay, the new social and political reality was a place to re-establish themselves. there is still the question of Ukrainians and Lemkos in the former East Prussia, who were forced to often settle in the least attractive places, far from cities with limited access to electricity and water. Some of them worked on state farms in the lowest paid jobs. At this point, I will show you just a few of the most important methodological inspirations. I have taken practices of dwelling as a central research category in my project in this presentation. I understand the practices following Michel Desserteau as activities that are, quote, multiform, resistance, tricky, and stubborn procedures that elude the discipline without being outside the field in which it is exercised, end of quote. And I supplement this category with dwelling, defined according to Tim Ingold as being in the landscape. Dwelling the landscape through bodily practices such as walking, trampling, and working the land. Practices of dwelling are thus, in the context of palaces adapted to state farms, actions of workers that go against the official scripts for the use of this space, both manorial and socialist. Strategies of resistance, tactics in the Desserteau's terms. It is important to note that the state farms were closed as a result of the political and economic transition in Poland in 1989. For the PGR workers, this meant sudden unemployment and permanent degradation. A great inspiration for me in researching and writing about degraded social groups is the Polish ethnographer Tomasz Rakowski, who develops his concept of the ethnography of the degraded human being. A framework I use in my research is Ariela Azoulai's notion of potential history. In this view, potential history, quote, strives to recover, reconstruct, and account for diverse worlds that persist despite the historical limits of our world, end of quote. The second part of Azoulai's research project is unlearning imperialism. In the context of Polish state farms and well aware of differences, I am interested in the unlearning of the serfdom complex and manorial legacy. A potential history of state farms would involve the retrieval of processes and relationships that have been underrepresented in previous historiography, the potential arising from the changing functions of the palace and the emergence of new subjectivities. Of course, there is also a large group of studies by Polish scholars on the memory and emotions of the post-war period in Poland. These are some of the studies I use. Due to the limited time, I will only signalize the phenomena and problems that were the result of the presence of PGRs in the palaces. According to interviews with former PGR employees, the presence of state farms in the Polish countryside in the first 2 decades after World War II was helpful in restoring social order, primarily because of the possibility of stable employment and settlement. At the same time, PGR workers often changed jobs in search of a better place, which can be seen as a sign of ambivalence. What interests me in historical and biographical sources? How do workers write and speak about the PGR? What do they not mention? Who could count on good housing? How do they use the palace? Who lived in the palace in early years? Mostly working class people rather than bureaucrats who were in short supply after World War II. How did the function and perception of the palace change over the years? And in this place, I see a tendency from democratic access for all workers to the professionalization of state farms in the 70s, when the palaces functioned as a kind of residence for the PGR director. I am also interested in the figure of the PGR director, which changed over the following decades. In the beginning, when it was still a state land properties, państwowe nieruchomości ziemskie, the directors were former landowners. In the 50s and 60s, they were already people, mostly from the working class with university education, who perhaps, due to the lack of other role models, in a certain way assumed the role of the neo-landowner, hunting horses, living in a palace, which was interestingly described by Jarosław Abramow-Neverly in the drama Derby in the Palace, Derby w Pałacu. Since the 70s, with the modernization of state farms, directors have taken on the role of modern managers. When it comes to the ethnic dimension of the policy of the state farms in former East Prussia, we have, of course, a big question about the state violence and policy towards Germans, Masurians, Warmians, Ukrainians, and Lemkos, Operation Vistula. What was the experience of working in the state farms for people from these groups? In which positions did they work? Where did they live? In what they do? They mention the palace. What place did they occupy in the PGR community? What relationships did they have with their neighbors? Another dimension of the PGR's activity in palaces that I would like to highlight is the issue of class and the redress of class injustice. What was unexpected for me during the research is that this topic was rarely used in propaganda messages. However, it is worth noting that during the entire period of socialism, PGRs were also rarely written about, and there are not too many mentions of them. Perhaps this is due to the problematic nature of state farms, some of them, but not all, as Dorota Mycielska and Włodzimierz Zun, among others, have noted, were spectacularly unprofitable. And as a result of a negative stereotype of such enterprises and their workers was created relatively quickly. The socialist authorities did not much to fight with this stereotype at the level of media representation. Now I would like to mention that in my fieldwork area, the presence of state farms guaranteed the survival of palaces and manor houses. Wherever PGRs did not exist or were dissolved before 1989, palaces are ruins. From the point of view of the PGR workers, the palace was the center of life of the state farm community. A medical clinic, kindergarten, and school located in the palace are mentioned particularly often. This leads us to the issue of education and the expansion of educational opportunities, which is strongly present in the memories and memoirs of people from the working class, as described by Agata Zysiak or Magda Szcześniak. Another strong memory of former workers is a cinema in a ballroom. During the research process, I realized that most of my interviewees were born in the 40s and 50s. So the collected material is based on the memories of people who experienced the first 2 decades of the state farms as children. These biographical interviews are full of images of games around the palace, climbing on palace's towers and sunbathing on them, fishing in the summer and skating on palace's ponds in the winter, or one of my favorite memories of a zoo technician from the state farm in Skandławki, playing houses, which meant collecting elements of the palace facade that had fallen off the building and using these remains to build houses in which the children lived. I see these kind of activities undertaken by children of PGR workers as practices of dwelling and growing into this landscape. Now I would like to move on the last part of my paper onto an example of the grassroots practices of dwelling, and I will show you the picture of Stanisława Bigus, a Ukrainian PGR worker, posing with her daughter against the background of a palace taken over by state farms in the village Bęsia in 1955. It is important to note that the photo comes from the archives of Stefan Bigus, who until recently ran a website dedicated to the history of the village of Bęsia. As a local historian and former employee of State Farm, he collected memories, photos, and documents of the inhabitants and made them available on his website. So we are looking at a part of a virtual grassroots archive. As we can see in the picture, both figures have assumed casual poses. The photo was taken during a walk and developed in sepia, which you can see, emphasizing the familiarity of the palace. The central issue of Bigus's memoirs, written at the end of her life, is her work on the state farm, which she began 3 days after arriving in Bęsia. Quote, "For the first so-called bell in my life, I went. me, my father, my sister, and my brother. For some time, I did all the farm work with horses, such as plowing, tiling, harrowing, haymaking, harvesting, transporting hay. We used the farm equipment left by the previous owner." End of quote. For Bigus, then, working the land and the landscape is the first form of dwelling and, in Ingold's view, a permanent record of one's presence. With the precision of a chronicler, Bigus describes the farm buildings, livestock, and farm equipment that arrived. A barn with 5 cows, warehouses for potatoes and beets, a stable, a carpenter's shop, a blacksmith's shop. Judging by the detail of the description, this was the most experienced and inhabited landscape. Quote, "In the early 50s, I worked as a milkmaid in the cowshed on the estate. There were 4 of us working there. There were already many cows in the barn, so each of us had to milk 23 cows. At that time, there was no kindergarten in Bensia, so I sometimes took my children to work with me." End of quote. The milkmaids on the PGRs worked more than a dozen hours a day in toxic conditions, usually without a day off. The workday began at 4 in the morning, and this group was the lowest paid on the state farms. The moment captured in the photograph is therefore special. The reservoir of bodily practices, which consisted of walking, tramping, viewing, hide and seek in the park, or finally the land and landscape work that was so important to Bigus, served on a broader level to grant her in a previously unfamiliar, because simultaneously East Prussian and state farm space. The PGR worker's relaxation with her daughter in front of the palace is an emanation of this, a sign of leisure spent in a place that was not accessible to her a few years ago. In this sense, the history of the PGR palaces would tell the story of the dismantling of previous hierarchies, the democratization and commodification of palace spaces, and finally, the dismantling of property, and only in later years its distribution. And even if all this happened only in the field of potentiality, it is in these micro-practices and gestures that the fundamental transgression should be found from the perspective of groups and individuals. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation and for perfect timing. And now I would like to present our last speaker. Yehoshua Ecker is a lecturer of early modern and modern Jewish history at both Bud Shorenstein Center for Jewish Studies, University in Florida, and the Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Touro University in New York. His research interests encompass local histories, elites, diasporas, and networks in imperial and post-imperial settings. Ecker's scholarly work has concentrated on Jewish Ottoman elites and networks, as well as Jewish communities and elites in Habsburg and Polish Galicia. Today, Yehoshua Ecker will join us via Zoom and will present on remembering the feudal order in newer times, the Jewish turn in Eastern Galician landed estates.
Okay. I hope you can hear me and see the presentation as well. It's a bit of a complex logistical. Can you hear me?
Yes, we see you and hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so let me begin. So first of all, thank you for your invitation to speak in this fascinating conference. I've been following as much as I could given the time difference. And I will catch up. Now, as it turns out, I'll be taking the discussion to another region and to a different group and also a different period. I'll be speaking about the Jewish turn in the Eastern Galician landed estates and the way it recaptured and partially recreated the very recent feudal past that preceded it. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the region, but it's worth pointing out the place. The decades following 1848 saw the rise in this region of a Jewish gentry and landowning class, particularly Habsburg province of Galicia or Galicia. It was the product of legal reforms that took place between 1848 and 1868 that eventually gave full equal rights to Jews and brought about the creation of a Jewish landowning group. While individual Jews were given permission to own land and estates even before 1848, the new legal reality introduced a large and growing Jewish presence among the landed gentry of Galicia. Now, the Jewish formal entry into the ranks of landowning society coincided with the abolition of serfdom and was part of a process of opening up landowning to new arrivals outside the traditional circles of the nobility. Aiming to replace regional and customary laws with a unified legal system, the Habsburg legal reform repositioned Jews in society and began a long process of legal, political, social, and economic change, promoting the ideas of legal equality. These changes coincided also with changes in the legal status of serfs and peasants at the same pace beyond the end of serfdom. Landowning itself was therefore undergoing rapid and profound changes at the same time that many Jews have joined the group. As landowning has developed within a particular social and legal structure, the legal reforms set in motion complex processes of change and the difficult adjustment of old established traditions to new realities. While legal realities may have changed overnight, practices and traditions took much longer to change. New social realities retained many elements of the old. Looking at what was preserved from the world before, and the more gradual and nuanced process of change reveals forms of local remembering. We can see the Galician model, the world that was there before 1848 and in many ways continued after that. Now, the Jewish experience through this world offers insights into navigating new realities and social relationships and the preservation and recreation of former structures and relationships. So this paper explores some of the ways the old order was remembered and performed even after it had lost its legal grounds in ideological, political, and religious logic. The one that we see here. As the new realities first introduced in 1848 were themselves radically changed within a century, and by 1944 they were systematically destroyed, the sources for these acts of social memory are themselves mostly products of later acts of remembering, particularly in memoirs written in later periods, even very close to our time. So these are the main sources I will use today. It corresponds to the rising interest in this topic in from the Polish academic side, but the focus here is going to be on Jewish memoirs which highlight the Jewish side of the story, which I find very missing in many of the analyses of the group as a whole. By 1939, there were, as a result of the process of Jewish introduction to the landowning field, hundreds of rural estates in Poland in general, and in Galicia in particular, which were owned by Jews. Hundreds more held on lease, and many thousands of Jewish families who made their living in administrative and managerial positions in rural estates. The vast majority of those were in the former Habsburg lands of Galicia, and most of those in the eastern parts of the province. As most Jews, as most Galician Jews and most Jewish landowners were concentrated in eastern Galicia, it is particularly useful in exploring the Jewish landowner and Jewish estate realities and developments. Now, in general, one of the main components of the recreation of feudal norms, modes, relationships, and practices that predated the large-scale inclusion of Jews in a newly defined gentry was the lack of other models. If we're talking about the feudal model and everything that it entailed, it was not immediately or clearly replaced by any other viable form. So in stepping into the shoes of former landowners and assuming many of their roles, Jewish owners, as well as leaseholders and managers, assumed all the other social functions and practices associated with these roles. The growing group of Jewish landowners appropriated and redeveloped to differing degrees the imagery and behavior, the style, aspirations, external and structural aspects of the older landowning groups. Significantly, the older groups of landowners were still active and still around, and they held on to traditional roles and positions themselves. In interacting with them and joining their ranks, their example was a very powerful guide. Furthermore, much of the similarities in lifestyle could also be attributed to similar physical conditions, and the overlap in place and circumstances between the old and new groups. Estates, after all, were often in distant locations. They required special transportation solutions and afforded the resources to solve these problems through what they had to offer in case of transportation, riding, and carriage travel. And that might be the first example to look at in this context. The propensity of carriage rides to and from and between rural estates made carriages, for example, another statement of status and class, where ordinary Jewish families were not inclined to keep carriages, footmen, teams of horses, stables, stable staff, carriage drivers, etc. Even if they were well-to-do and could afford it, the life in the estates usually made such arrangements necessary. So carriages are about one symbolic and functional element in belonging to the landowning group. Peasants would use carts, landowners would afford carriages. Owning more than one estate would make the frequent travel even more ubiquitous. Encountering Jewish landowners in Encountering Jewish landowners in their carriages became a common experience, one that is told in the memoirs that I look at. As a gap was opening between the new Jewish landowners and the rest of Jewish society, this is how many non-landowning Jews met and remembered their landed coreligionists. Now, even family events and meetings would require the use of carriages. And as a grandson of a leading landholding family in the Stockholm area recalled in his memoir about family meetings and gatherings, his father and uncles meeting with their father, that would be the image of a long line of carriages standing outside the townhouse as each arrived from their different countryside holdings. So even the mundane issue of transportation creates a differentiated group and perpetuates the necessities and style of landholding. Now, while carriages in and by themselves are not part of the feudal order, they serve to highlight the elements of continuity picked up by the new and expanding Jewish group of landowners. The overarching principle that can be applied to the way the feudal order was preserved and regenerated among the new landowners was the preservation of the ethos of the landowner, a model that encompassed an entire range of behaviors. This coincided with and was amplified by the preservation of the same ethos by older groups of landowners and by the peasantry, the former serfs. In the eyes of memoirists such as Michael Brava and his son Abraham, who were well acquainted with Jewish landowners, were closely related to landowners, and worked with them, joining the landowning circles was perceived as becoming integrated in the Polish social type of landowner, with all its stereotypical attributes. Their descriptions of such individuals take these attributes for granted, even if they were still practicing Jews, maintaining good ties and extending help to fellow Jews. Michael Brother's portrayal of landowners like Aaron Leib Maya, who leased multiple estates before becoming the owner of Jurków Górny, a large estate near Chorodenka, has him act as a Polish nobleman, spending money accordingly and highly regarded in the circles of landowners. His being the offspring of Hasidic rabbis notwithstanding. The social attitude adopted by the family were described by others as well as appropriate to their social standing. Now, the preservation of the ethos, or reinventing the ethos of the benevolent landowner and his idealized characteristics, finds its place in the memoirs of members of landowning elites. The landowner's responsibilities toward his dependents in the estate, taking care of workers and peasants, improving their living environment, are portrayed for example, by philosopher Martin Buber, son and grandson of large landowners. He spent much of his childhood in his father's and grandfather's estates, and would himself become an absentee landowner after his father's death. He penned an idyllic image of his father, carefully planned construction of new quarters for his estate workers. Buber also echoed the idealization of horsemanship, another motive in landowning circles, in his idyllic reminiscence about the way his father greeted each of his many horses individually, as well as the bond he himself forged with his own horse. The image of Jewish landowners of their children on horseback mirror a similar theme in narratives and imagery of the nobility. Photographs attest to the incorporation of horses and horse riding to the social repertoire of this group. Sometimes even long-lost photographs are still described, remembered for their symbolic and not typically Jewish message, such as Davich's description of his uncle and cousins on horseback in their estate in a photo album he had looked at in his youth, photos sent to relatives, and functioned as a statement of status, standing in sharp contrast to other family photos. Jewish landowning society developed along parallel lines and mirrored the nobility, the older landowning society, also in forging family ties and creating a network of landowning families and a distinct and intermarried social class. Straddling multiple estates in different regions, they formed networks of estates and families where marriages served as the glue and bond. Individual families would opt to form dynastic alliances with other similarly situated families. Within a few generations, they formed a more and more defined social group that tended to form alliances within itself, across distances, linking different holdings and lineages in an intricate and growing network of marriages and multi-generational relationships. This growing social cohesion has led to group projects such as the establishment of an agricultural association and the publication of a journal towards the end of the period until 39. New privileges preserved and translated older privileges into new models. The elections and electoral curia, or voting classes, with the criteria of landowning incorporating an increasing number of Jewish landowners, grouped all landowners together, whatever their origin or denomination, linking them as a social and political class, while at the same time separating them from other social groups. Jewish and non-Jewish voters were put into one political playing field, excluding all the others, indicating also the government's view that affirmed the group's affinities in a similar manner that Jewish observers noted. The model of the landlord also prolonged and preserved models of high-handedness in treating the peasants, including, for example, beating. While some memoirists indicate that for Jewish landowners, physical violence was where they drew the line, others make it clear that this practice was held by some owners, and a Jewish landowner beating his peasants was not a rare event. Some also mention the submissiveness of the peasants in the face of such violence, the continuation of long experiences under the feudal system, and the preservation of hierarchical order. In another scene described by Oskar Koffler, the peasants at Petlikovce, where his father ran the estate, bid farewell to their perceived lord and benefactor when they left for the war in 1914, in a ceremony in which each kissed the hands of the lord of the manor, echoing long-gone feudal relations and ceremonials. We don't have an image of that, but if we look at another place, Koshilovce, recently the topic of memoir and research, we can see a similar scene, in this case, a place with both Christian and Jewish connections of the farmers and peasants bidding farewell to the deceased lord of the manor, that evoke again the image of such ceremonies. Another aspect, and a tricky one for the Jewish owners, was the landowner as patron of the local church. That was continuing feudal traditions and was stretching the expectations from Jewish landowners to the extreme. However, as the brothers mentioned before note, some Jewish owners went as far as building and renovating churches and followed what was expected of them as proper lords of the manor. Here we have to rely on the brothers' generalization because they chose not to bring examples, and constructing these acts of charity towards the community was a challenging choice. The question of church patronage has also manifested in church yearbooks, where a place was usually given to the name of the local patrons. And that's also an old tradition. In case that Jews were the local owners, the editors resorted to different solutions to incorporate the new reality into the established formula. There were several shifts before a new accepted solution could be found, changing the title from patrons to owners, not naming the owners at all, and then considering the realities and not sure how permanent they were, the names were first omitted, then added, and eventually omitted again, only indicating that the owner was Jewish. Alongside the issue of churches, a translation or adaptation of these obligations to the Jewish context is supporting the local Jewish community, consecrating a synagogue or a prayer house, mentioned very often in the memoirs of the interwar period. Hunting parties and game meat were symbolic elements of the feudal lord's prerogatives. Many Jewish landowners also embraced these practices, and Ravitch, for example, recalls deer meat being served in a Jewish wedding in a landowning circles. So the image of the Jewish landowner came to closely resemble the previous models of landowners that were familiar and still prevalent. It included every aspect of that model, more than we have time to discuss in this brief paper. Jewish landowners took to collecting, to agricultural experimentation, and more, acquiring the entire lifestyle of the landowning nobility. To conclude, the preservation of the estates themselves, with their particular social and legal structures, made the preservation of the economic, political, and social relations associated with them a staple of estate life, even after the legal shifts. Encounters with landowners reported in memoirs evoke the image of a group externally assimilated into the landowning class, even if their sentiments are different. As one memoir described, the image of a Szklarczyk, Polish-speaking, living on his estate, who accepted his young Jewish guest in a room full of weapons hanging on the walls. The feudal order, pervasive presence, manifested then in multiple ways, and was acutely remembered and recounted in the accounts and memoirs that paid attention to the Jewish landowning social group and to individual Jewish landowners. Most of the memoirs were recorded and published after the Second World War, in yet a new world of memory. That complicates even more the work of reconstructing the previous layers of the past, but this is already a separate discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. And before we move on, I would like to present shortly our discussant. Marta Kurkowska-Budzan is a professor at the Faculty of History at Jagiellonian University. She holds a background in history and sociology from Jagiellonian University and the University of Kent. She has completed postdoctoral fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and New York University's Remark Institute. Her current research focuses on historical methodology, history of historiography, the cultural history of post-Second World War Poland, and the labor culture of 20th century Europe. Professor Kurkowska-Budzan leads the interdisciplinary research group Homo Laborans at Jagiellonian University, which explores the intersections of labor, culture, environment, and society in historical contexts. Dear Professor, please take the floor.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank organizers for inviting me to this conference, which is extremely interesting to me as my field of research is cultural memory and heritage. So since this session carries the concept of our conference in its title, and so I cannot resist the temptation to tell you a joke related to the idea of the longue durée. This is a risky insider joke from the region where I come from, which is the northeastern Mazovia, the land of small gentry, smallhold gentry. So how do you call out the horses in a cart if you want them to stop? You know? Well, a nobleman would shout prr, while a peasant shouts prr. Well, okay, thank you. There are some understanding of this. It's so, I said it's an insider joke, but I have to tell you this is the joke that, well, along with many other sayings and beliefs that are somehow hard to understand today or in different parts of Poland, was still in use in my region in the 1980s. Well, the reason for that was that villages in this region were divided into noble and peasant ones. And meaning they were mostly inhabited by smallholder nobility or peasants, but their lives had looked the same for centuries. They didn't differ much in wealth. Yet even in the 30s, a marriage between a noble woman and the peasant was still noticed by neighbors. So this is a piece of cultural memory, I believe. And going back to the title of our session, the Longue Durée, this term invites a conversation about heritage. And both are grounded in three key pillars: material objects, such as architecture, well discussed during this conference, cultural memory, and nature, environment. Well, as for cultural memory, it's compelling to consider it, as Justyna demonstrated in her presentation, as embodied memory. So, the question to you, to you or to us, how can we start thinking about embodied memory more as heritage, not just memory? I mean, it's not just memory, but as a heritage. Can we think about this in this way? Would it be useful, in your opinion, if we consider your research? And another question, is it possible to break free from this negative connotation that inevitably arises here, the labor of unwanted heritage, when we speak about the state farms and what is left? The third pillar is nature, not only as a force shaped by human intervention, but perhaps even more significantly, as one that reclaims control over material objects, destroying them, as heritage conservators would say. The manors are destroyed or going into ruin, so we must preserve them. We must preserve objects, artifacts. There's an urge to preserve material objects. But there's a nature out there. And this is my second, after this risky joke, this is my second risk take here today. I want to bring here Caitlin De Silvi work titled Curated Decay. In her book, she offers a fresh perspective on how we engage with these three pillars: material objects, cultural memory, and nature. She explores how loss and material change can open up new possibilities for interacting with the past, challenging the conventional idea of preserving material heritage in a static form. We still are talking heritage, but not in a static form. De Silva redefines, she uses entropy and decay, and she redefines entropy not as a disorder, but as more possibilities. By viewing heritage as an evolving process that embraces decay and disintegration, we allow for new interpretations and forms of memory to arise. This shift broadens our understanding of heritage, recognizing the nature's influence, often perceived as destructive, as in fact part of the ongoing transformation of heritage. And I noticed that when it comes to manors, the architectural dominants, the past and present, there's still tendency to ignore the post-war 50 years of the life, I would say it's in capital letters, life, the other than homes of the landowners' functions. The 50 and, well, now even 80 years post-Second World War history still is the history of people, the history of communities. And talking about that history in terms of destruction deprives the community their history. We, in this discourse of preservation, we erase their life experiences. Well, I'd like to repeat, it's 80 years after Second World War. So again, the open question to all of us interested researching the heritage, are we able to look at the post-war history of manors, palaces, as the entropic history without mourning, the history of other possibilities, the history that includes the transformation into so-called ruin, taken over by nature, which is also local. The nature could be local. The nature is also local heritage, even the nature that destroys the material objects. The nature is creative at the site. Well, this is the proposal of new form of heritage still, and I would like to underline this, it's still, the ruin still has some functions, some social functions. It's not just rubbish. It's not aside the community. So it still lives. Okay, so I commented somehow Justyna's paper, and I gave you those two questions, and now let me go back to the paper number 1. And again, let me bring here the heiress of Maluszyn, perhaps well known to Polish readers, Ludwika Ostrowska, born in 1851. Her memoirs were published some time ago and gave us an intimate insight into her motives and daily life. And what we learned from these memoirs, we learned that her high social status fueled her commitment to charitable activities, driven by the imperatives of heart, conscience, and reason. She focused on improving living conditions and education for the poor, the underprivileged, as we would say today, including establishing a care center for children and promoting vocational training for women, giving jobs. In today's context, what do you believe are the contemporary, I quote, imperatives of heart, conscience, and reason for castle owners? I know that you were talking a bit about that, but I want to hear like a statement, very short, brief statement. And Well, the second comment is we are I'm generalizing. It's my opinion that in public discourse about the manor houses, nevertheless they are from in Kresy or in Western territories or in central Poland, we are avoiding talking conversations about economic motivations, the market, and the fact that palaces, castles are real estate on the property market. And they are not in economic vacuum. They were not in economic vacuum in the past. Generations of the owners back lived by the land, profited from human and material sources, made money and spent it according to their own priorities, often very far from the ethos of charity. Can we talk about this in contemporary economic situation with no sentiments? So would Cezary, as a practitioner, if I may call you this way in the context of the castle, would you be willing to elaborate on this topic? And the third question is just short one. What do you mean by traditional culture being reactivated in the castle? What culture? Whose culture? In your castle, in this particular place. Okay, and Yehoshua, hello. Shuki, hello. Yehoshua presented a compelling case of new property owners replicating the culture of the former land-owning class. It is uncertain, I mean, this is just, I think aloud, whether the term enculturation is appropriate here, likely not. Yehoshua argues that this imitation, I mean, I'm using various terms because I didn't find the one in your paper, where perhaps I missed that. The imitation stems from a lack of alternative models and also suggests that material conditions also played a significant role. The example of, the example of beating children as peasants doesn't speak to me. However, the example of the horses and carriages, both a practical necessity for transportation and the marker of social status, is particularly insightful and inspiring. It offers a rich field for anthropological investigation in this particular situation, the imitation of culture. It's something beyond just the history of art, history of objects. So I look forward to seeing how this research develops. And also, as I understand, Yehoshua employed the concept of lifestyle in the Weberian sense, linking it to the culture of social classes. I'd like to mention here the works of Andrzej Siciński and his teams of sociologists from the 70s, mid-70s, and they research on the classless society of the People's Republic of Poland. They introduced a significant nuance to the concept of lifestyle. And the eventual definition of lifestyle described it as, I quote, a set of everyday behaviors specific to a given community or individual. In other words, a distinctive way of being that differentiates one community or individual from others. And more broadly, lifestyle, and I think this is most important in the research, can be understood as a consciously or unconsciously adopted life strategy. And well, I'm just curious if you find this compelling to your research as a life strategy. And have you considered expanding your analytical categories? If so, are there is there anything in historical sources that could inspire such an expansion, that you could come up with the other research categories rooted in the sources, in these wonderful narrative sources you have? These are my comments and questions, and thank you. Thank you again for your wonderful, inspiring papers.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I think that thank you for your questions and insights. And I think that we will start with the order you suggested. So I will ask Justyna for some reflections on the suggested topics.
Okay. Thank you for your suggestions and questions. Embodied memory as a heritage. It's very interesting because until this day, probably, I was thinking about embodied memory as a kind of research method or methodology, which is, of course, in the connection with heritage, and through this method, we can research material objects, cultural memory, and of course nature, environment, or I don't know, cultural landscapes. But I think that I think it's very interesting shift to think about embedded memory as a heritage, just straight. And I'm thinking, I just would like to tell that I'm thinking about embodied memory as embodied knowledge, and in this, especially when I'm thinking about my research field work, is very important because for my interviewees, for people from working class, sometimes this kind of a conversation through embodied memory is more obvious to describe their experiences in the state farms than, for example, biographical interview. So thank you. I will think about this. And yes, second question. I'm not sure that I understand exactly, but unwanted heritage, state farms as a unwanted heritage. Yeah, it's for me it's interesting because through those few years until I am research the state farms. I, of course, read a lot about a negative stereotype of the state farms, but for me, in my research, I'm trying to be very close to perspective of working class people, of PGR workers, former PGR workers, and for those people, especially, of course, in my research fieldwork, the state farms were probably the brightest moment in their histories. I mean, and this very specific moment of history of those palaces which were adapted to the state farms was for those people very special. And so today, when I am talking with them about this moment, it was fantastic moment. I mean, and of course I see that in their during the biographical interviews, they are trying to deal with this negative stereotype, but mostly their stories is about bright moments. I mean, yeah. And third question about possibilities. And I agree with you that ruins have a function, and for me it's obvious because in my research and in my research project is probably the most important statement, and I'm more interested about reality, and of course today some of those palaces in my research fieldwork are ruins, but some of them are still have a social function, and I'm interested in the ruins and in another still alive buildings, but probably maybe I should stop now. So thank you.
Thank you. And Minister Lusiński.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Sorry. Let me answer your questions from the end. The third one was about what culture is expected to be brought back to the manors. Well, in most cases, it's natural expectation to be high culture. In a living room or manor, you'd rather expect a piano recital than folk music. And that's what I provide the neighborhood with, organizing piano recitals or camera concerts. It's also because I like it. I organize it, I pay for it. I treat people with whatever I can offer, just like at home. So people are waiting for that occasion, because it's not only people from my circle that they would come much more often, but general public comes for sightseeing between 5 and 25 days a year, and a concert like once or twice a year. But it would be piano recital. Well, we are also expected, especially Poles who own the palaces, to support the folk events. But we don't have to organize them. Support is enough. Presence is enough to show that we also care. So when I happen to support events like folk festivals, like the kind of a new tradition, if you know what I think, festival, either Polish or Ukrainian, from the region where I come from, and it used to be Stanisławów, now Ivano-Frankivsk. And this would expectation to support this, to treat it as equal, is quite broad. But nobody expects me to perform folk music, or the pianists I employ. Second question is about running real estates. Nowadays, realities, and Maciej Radziwiłł already elaborated on this, and his scale, I mean, of one's magnate family, it also translates somehow to the middle noble class who owned rather manors than palaces. Without land, it's difficult to maintain. And the land is in other hands. I mean, usually there are people who bought the land, they profit from the EU payments, they organize production, but they don't care for the remnants of manors. But the remnants of manors is something we do care in the Polish Gentry Association, and we're trying to regain for the families. Sometimes it's a success, rare success, but when it happens, it's too late. That happens to Niegolewski family, who recently regained Niegolewo, near Poznań, the place which belonged to them from the 13th century. Very long tradition. And what? Wanda Niegolewska, my colleague, as a chairperson of a Wielkopolska branch Greater Poland branch of Polish Gentry associations, is told me, Cezary, I mean, nobody has now money and physical strength to do something, anything like you did in the last 15 years. Sorry, I mean, we are too weak and too old, and it's tens of millions, which we cannot afford. So they will sell. Of course, it's an argument for both the public. Okay, why should we, state, give back the property, the remnants of miners to Gentry? If they, when they regain it, they sell it. Well, it's difficult. In most of the cases, people who rebuilt the palaces, they try to organize hotels and things like this. It's, I mean, my neighbors, Mr. Czmuda and Mr. Shuda, did like this, but you know, it's their choice. I mean, they are the newcomers to the circle of those who used to have manors or palaces. On the other hand, it's Mr. Piotr Komierowski, who is a nobleman, and used to live, I mean, his family, Komierowski, used to live in Komierowo for like 600-700 years, almost like Niegolescy in Niegolewo. When he regained the property, he profited from his position of a successful business person in the West, renovated it, almost rebuilt, with strict architectural expectations of state services that care for heritage, and organized a hotel. And he would also organize recital from time to time, but on a daily basis is a hotel run by his daughter. That's to produce income, and there's something we understand, and we admitted the family into Domus Polonorum, where that's gathering a small association of only 50 persons who own palaces or manors, I mean rural estates, and preserve the traditions of Polish manor. I mean, normally we do not accept business people who run hotels, but Piotr Komierowski is an exception. Jerzy Donimirski is another one. We could not deny them. The third one corresponded somehow to democratization of palace space, as you called it. And it's mostly ruins, quite often taken by nature. I've seen many such instances in the neighborhood. It corresponds somehow to unwanted heritage of state farms, sometimes unwanted, but there are still remnants of the appreciation that it belonged to everybody, right? We used to work there. We used to, I mean, the peasants. There was a school there, or other things that belonged to community. And now it's again owned by private person who may admit or not. So the new role is expected. And we are expected, as owners of palaces, we are expected to let people in. That's what I do, but that's my choice. But when I get a grant for something, say plaster in particular room, I'm obliged to let people in up to 25 days a year. And I duly organize it and do sightseeing with my sister, one of us, 28 days a year. But when I don't get a grant, I'm usually limited to, let's say, 15 days between May and September. That's how the space is organized. But there is a general expectation that every person may come, see, enter the space. Did that satisfy your question? Thank you.
Thank you. And Yehoshua, we're also waiting for your reflections.
Thank you for your questions and comments, and they certainly opened a lot of interesting thoughts and ideas. I want actually to refer to one of your earlier questions to the other participants about the reconstruction of a certain place. And it's also, in my view, it's a reconstruction of a certain moment. There's a choice of which moment in time you choose to present. And that choice is, in many cases, although not always, excludes the other moments. So if there are different periods, usually it goes into the golden age or ideal moment. And that would be 18th century rather than 19th century, perhaps. So there's a lot of decision-making and choices there as well, which is relevant for the manners I'm dealing with, because if they are reconstructed in that area, they're reconstructed in their pre-Jewish period as a matter of choice almost always, and they do have a very long history to account for. And the one caveat there is that unlike Western Poland, I'm very jealous of discussion of material culture because in Galicia, there's hardly anything standing. I think I know of one manor house relevant to all of my studies that is still standing and by accident, and that's a villa built in the 1930s. Everything else was destroyed deliberately several times. So there's not one wave of destruction, but many. To your question about how to call this imitation, replication, or many other possible terms, I would say on the face of it, all of them. It's actually a spectrum. And I highlighted the similarities, but there's everything in between, from posing as the previous owners and you wouldn't tell the difference, including conversion, to maintaining a strictly Jewish estate and transforming it completely into a Jewish community. Complete with all the services associated with it. One of the estates I pointed out, Potok, undergoes this kind of transition because it's bought for Rabbi Friedman of the Hasidic dynasty, and it's transformed into a place of pilgrimage for his followers. So even that rabbinic court needs to write carriages and function as an estate because there are certain things that need to be done in a certain way. It's even more complex than that because in many cases, these are not newcomers to the estate, but they are people involved in the business before. In many cases, the people who actually manage these properties when the owners were living in Lviv or Warsaw or Paris or Vienna. And this allowed the legal changes allowed them to legally acquire what they are already managing for many years or sometimes generations. So it's kind of an official recognition of a reality that is going on for a very long time. And of course, they are integrated in this society. For them, it's a continuity and not a break. And they know exactly what they're getting into. And of course, there's the exact opposite group, the people that ask themselves, what does it mean to be wealthy? How do the rich behave? And you can see today, people becoming, the nouveau riche. What do the rich do? They buy a private jet. You buy a private jet because there's a set of behaviors, right? A lifestyle that's expected of you. And there are people who become rich and buy an estate. not necessarily Jewish. Everybody in that gets rich can decide that the way to preserve wealth in that time and place is to invest in buying an estate or many of them, and not necessarily even settle there. And these are absentee owners, and so there's a lot of variety. And I highlighted the path of similarity to the concept. And again, there's a lot of things to be done there and things to think about. To the concept of lifestyle, I really I found fascinating your pointing out the definitions, and I would even play with those in the sense that a lifestyle is like a life choice, also at different stages in life. I would say that the first 10 years are not the same as the next 10 years. And when we're talking about the third generation, it's also a different choice altogether. So the lifestyle actually changes constantly. And finally, what I find is that the process of making this from individual choices and opportunities into a social group that maintains a certain group lifestyle is the marriages and associations that are created. So once we move from 1848 to 68 to 1890 to 1910 to 1930, in some places we're talking about the fifth generation with many relations and associations in other estates. They're marrying into the social group. There's kind of an expectation of what kind of lifestyle you run. So it's not just individual choices, there's also kind of a group choice, which is a whole issue by itself, right? So the bottom line, it's complex, it's complicated, and obviously individual narratives take you to many different directions. And I was like plotting a golden path between all of them to show a certain variety of continuity, which we find a lot. And I hope I explained the major reasons that you would expect to find like basic elements of continuity.
Thank you. I would like to say thank you to our panelists and everyone who joined this panel. Thank you for stimulating discussions, and special thanks to our discussants for provoking insights. We are running out of time, but if you don't mind, and if there are any questions from the audience, I think we can prolong it a little bit.
Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. I have a question to each of you, and I have a question to Marta, but I can ask it in the coffee break. I don't agree with this, with the fact that we can enjoy the fact that the nature took the manner. I simply can't, but this is for later. Okay, so I have a question. I have a question for Shuki. So you largely described the Jewish land-owning elites as kind of the subclass within the Polish land-owning elites, which means that you describe them as separate, more or less. So my question would be how much they were separated from their Polish land-owning neighbors. You mentioned this example of a Kościołowce, and we know that Kurski's grandmother married actually a Polish nobleman, and that was what in a way led her in the Polish society. So how it was? No, wasn't. Okay, so my interpretation of
she brought the estate, he brought the title.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so my question would be about the intermarriages of the people from the Jewish landowning elites in Eastern Galicia with the ethnic Poles also having land, and also how the social life looked like. You mentioned this hunting, so did the Polish neighbor came in to join the hunting? So that would be first question. To Justyna, I want to ask about this process of domestication of the palace, So did people actually how they did perceive living in the palace? Because it's definitely happened if they entered the palace as people as dwellers. So how did it happen, and how they felt about living in the palace? And my last question to Cezary Lusiński. Well, I do appreciate the fact that you presented us with the story of how you are restoring the palace. It's impressive, and I'm always happy when I see the story with the happy ending, and this is a story of the happy ending for Broniszów Castle. But you didn't answer the question that you promised to answer, and that was how the owners of the palaces are perceived by the local communities in the western part of Poland. My impression is that we learned a lot about your sensitivity, your goals, your ambitions, your plans for what is to happen in the palace, your understanding of the high culture. But what about these locals? I learned that you divide them on these peasants who live around and who are not interested in the high culture, and on the teachers and the intelligentsia representatives who come to the high culture events with pleasure. And this is what I learned, but I didn't learn much about how the locals perceive you. It was somewhere under the surface, because you mentioned this case, or this, it was left unspoken, but you mentioned this robbery, and you showed this picture of the bedroom destroyed that you were to renovate, and we can only imagine what happened. So please tell us what happened. It would be great to learn more. Thank you.
Should we answer immediately, or are we collecting questions?
I think that we will collect questions. One question from the chat.
One commentary from the chat, from Facebook, from Kai Małachowski. It's a commentary for you, Yehoshua. I enjoyed a lot the superbly structured lecture on Galician Jews entering the ranks of landed gentry. There are, however, several important aspects I miss here. First, the religious shift toward Christianity. Second, acquiring titles of nobility. And third, representation in the parliamentary assemblies, both local and in Vienna. And fourth, involvement in Polish independence movement. So, kind of a commentary, but maybe you would like to address it.
So, Joshua, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief, but these questions truly ask about a really wide field and world. First, actually, I only have 20 minutes, and I think I stole a few more minutes. Which was not enough to talk about religious shifts and titles and parliamentarian representation and the participation in Polish independence and national struggles. And the answer to all of these, yes, they exist. And these are the circles where those interactions happen more than others. Back to the first question, I'll get back to the second. In terms of subclass, I would say that the Polish landowning society is also divided into many subclasses, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And we can differentiate a lot of groups, ennobled and not ennobled, foreigners, etc., etc. And the same is true for the Jewish group, and there are many overlaps, including intermarriages, but also including every kind of religious choice, from conversion, intermarriage, to a complete retaining of the Orthodox way of life. So just the overlaps can supply us with a lot of questions, and interesting. It's a fascinating field, right? The overlap of societies is always fascinating. What is opening here? Second question. No, first questions, the second part. The social interaction, the same applies. There are groups that totally boycott Jewish participation, and they are scandalized by it. They are both on the Polish side and on the Jewish side. I have a big problem of reconstructing the social world because of the destruction of the material culture, the places, the memoirs, the letters, the diaries, whatever was there. There's barely any archival material that gives us the social interaction. So you have to dig very carefully. And I was late to come to interviews. I've done some, but it should have been done in the 1960s. In terms of hunting parties, etc., yes. What you usually hear is that everybody's hunting together, visiting each other, because that's a great social opportunity. And like Marta said, it's about money and influence in politics, and it's a form not just of having fun, but of influencing politics and inviting the parliamentarian representative, etc., etc. So religious shift, we have everything. There are Jews who get titles. Some of them convert and some of them don't. The parliamentarian issue is a big issue. It's introducing this group into the high politics of the land regionally and in Vienna, and many representatives are coming from this group. And many people who become representatives can join the group because they're becoming part of the elite. Okay, I think I touched on everything. I'm sure I haven't answered everything completely, but I tried to point out directions.
Thank you.
And thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much, Yehoshua. And Justyna?
Okay, so thank you for this question. I think that living in the palaces for pre-war workers was a full of ambivalence experience, and during biographical interviews, they are describing this experience at first as a issue of dignity. And for example, they are talking a lot about right to view for to Palaces Park, for example, and they also talking about care practices to this material heritage, but of course in their own way. I mean that they were trying to dwell these spaces, which were also too big, too cold, especially in first few decades after Second World War. But in the same time, and of course during 70s and 80s, when the state farms built a lot of new buildings, blocks, working class people were moved to those new buildings, and for this group it was a kind of it was a big issue. I mean that very warm with electricity and water apartments was so important for these people. But in the same time, during interviews, they are talking about a kind of very specific feeling which they have to palace. I mean that they spent I don't know, few decades in those buildings. They spend their leisure time in these buildings, and today, when those palaces are in a private hands as a private property, they don't have access to these buildings, and it is a kind of sad story for those people. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Lusiński.
Thank you. I appreciate the question. I do admit it's true. I'm more focused on expectations towards new owners of palaces and manors. The expectation to have it open to the public. But you're right. I should classify the elements of perception, how we are perceived. Well, I could see a couple of negative ways of perception and a couple of positive ones. Let's start with negative. The first is strangers, whether German, Italian, French, or Pole from the city, especially if it's not originally Polish city, we are perceived as strangers, as newcomers to a local community, because the perception of themselves, I mean, the surrounding, peasant environment, goes back only to 2-3 generations, and short ones means 25 years or double 25 years to their grandparents who came from the east, or from Świętokrzyskie, or poor estates in Wielkopolska. They feel themselves that they are the locals, and they perceive myself and the owners as newcomers, strangers. Even if you had a link to the area like 300 years ago, but peasants don't know about links that were effective 300 years ago. Though Mrs. von Schlichting, she was aware of that, so we just communicated easily. Yet another element of which is a kind of negative one, which is the perception of us is we're wealthy, could afford to buy for several 100,000 zlotys, were in a position to renovate for millions of zlotys. So we are wealthy for the standards of an average person in the village. We are wealthy, which is negative because people should be equal and not wealthy. Of course, it's also an opportunity. I will send it in a minute. But the result is we are subject to burglary. And I had my property devastated twice within the last 5 years. Both my belongings and the cultural heritage that I renovated. As a positive elements, I would single out that we are perceived by more educated people, but also sometimes with simple peasants. We're perceived as a missing element in local social landscape. Either German or Polish, somebody should live in this manner. Also to provide opportunities. Because since we are wealthy, we should provide with certain opportunities. We should share some of our wealth. We also expected to be involved in the heritage efforts of people from the towns and cities. And I know a number of such people. I could single out Mr. Tomasz Mitlicki, who works both on behalf of Polish Catholic remnants, but in predominant way, he focuses on the German and Protestant heritage of the region. And this is much appreciated. So when we organize, say, seminars or conferences or gatherings like this for local community on a, say, Protestant church over there, it's appreciated by some. And last thing, we are welcome as parish members and supporters. I mean, provided that you are a religious person and that you are Catholic, because Protestant communities in my region has not regained its pre-war importance. Thank you.
Thank you. Once more, thank you for discussion, for panel. And now it's time for lunch.